North Korea recently launched a missile which it claims, for the first time, is capable of reaching the continental United States. Donald Trump, predictably, had a conniption fit. Many are speculating that we are on the verge of yet another war, this time with a rogue state with nuclear capability. For my entire adult life, I've been hearing about these escalating tensions between the US and North Korea. How did we get here? What has brought us to this point? We are looking at decades of history here. Too much to cover in just one video. So in this, the first of two parts, we'll talk about the Korean War and the events that led up to that. And then next time, we'll discuss the relationship with the two countries since that war ended. It is perhaps human nature to want to believe oneself to be completely right 100% of the time, and one's opponent is completely wrong. Sadly, life seldom works that way. And it's definitely not true in the case of Korea. As my mother told me, it takes two to tango. In 70 years of this conflict on the Korean Peninsula, the fear and mistrust between all the involved parties has prevented finding a real solution to the situation. Before we begin, let me just point out you can find links in the description below for the sources I've used in my research. Also, I'm doing my best with the pronunciation on some names and place names, so I apologize if I've gotten anything incorrect. The troubled history between the US and Korea goes back to at least the 1800s, and has continued to escalate and build since the beginning of the 20th century. At that time, the US allowed Korea to be claimed as part of Japan's sphere of influence at the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. Likewise, the US did not protest when Japan formally annexed Korea 5 years later. And at the end of World War I, at the Versailles Treaty Conferences, Korean nationalists again approached the US for intervention and help in their situation. And again, the US rejected the request, as it did not see any of its own national interest, and turned a blind eye to the Koreans' plight. Japan's brutal rule over Korea lasted for 35 years, only coming to an end when Japan was defeated at the end of World War II. And, at that time, due to the escalating tensions between the US and the Soviet Union and China, the US did finally see value in the Korean Peninsula's strategic location. Koreans initially welcomed the troops who liberated the country, both Russians and Americans. But then things really began to heat up. In what can only be called a bastardization of what was agreed between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Stalin before FDR died in 1945, the UN divided Korea along the 38th parallel, forming North and South Korea. This was originally planned simply as a temporary measure. What was supposed to be just a step on a road to an independent Korea has become seemingly permanent due to the breakdown in the relations between the US and USSR over the decades that followed. North Korea was initially occupied by Soviet forces and allied itself with the Soviets in China. The South was initially occupied by the US and allied itself with the West. Prompted by the UN, however, the two superpowers began to draw down their forces in the region. In May 1948, the USSR installed Kim Il-sung and his People's Democratic Republic of Korea as leader in the North. The US, however, has never recognized this government and has never established formal diplomatic relations. One article I read defined Kim's worldview as this, quote, "a hostile place with no reliable allies," end quote. Yet again, the specter of mistrust hangs over the Korean Peninsula. It is one that would infect each of Kim's successors. In August of that year, US generals installed hardline anti-communist Syngman Rhee as South Korea's first president, thus creating what appears to be an almost intractable ideological divide between the North and the South. Both leaders, North and South, were determined to reunite Korea, each under their own banner, of course. In the case of North Korea, soon after taking leadership of the country, Kim proposed an invasion of the South. He believed that the US withdrawal from the South would create a power vacuum, which he could leverage to a quick and easy victory. He was, however, still beholden to the Soviets, and they were preoccupied with Europe and the situation in Berlin. So Stalin opposed any invasion at that time. By 1949, the US and the USSR had withdrawn the majority of their troops from the region. And this did create a power vacuum, as Kim Il-sung had predicted. But it was South Korea who leveraged this to stage assaults into the north. Officially, the Korean War started in June 1950, But the truth is, it started well before that. It was already well underway. Perhaps from the very moment the country was split into two. Then, in 1950, there was a change of heart. Unfortunately, it was not a good one. Stalin had initially rejected Kim's plan to invade the South. By 1950, China's communist revolution had succeeded, which convinced him that the Korean invasion plan might just work after all, so he gave his consent. North Korea, supported by both the Soviet Union and China, invaded the South on the 25th of June, 1950. South Korea was caught completely off guard, to the point where its capital, Seoul, fell within 3 days. South Korean President Syngman Rhee criticized the initial response from the US, saying, "Our soldiers are very brave. They sacrificed themselves against the tanks. Korea is very hard up because aid was so low. It was too little, and it was too late." End quote. In fairness, though, the US was hardly resting on its laurels. On the 27th of June, just 2 days after the invasion, President Truman committed the US to intervening. And 1 day after that, on the 28th of June, an emergency session of the UN Security Council authorized the dispatch of UN forces to repel the invasion. It should be noted that the USSR, the Soviet Union, was not present for this vote. The Soviets were boycotting the UN as the UN was refusing to let China's new government join. Some speculate that Kim may have jumped the gun on the invasion timeline. If Russia had been present for that meeting, they could have blocked the resolution and prevented the UN from sending troops. 21 countries contributed troops to the UN force, with 88% coming from the US. And US General Douglas MacArthur was appointed Supreme Commander of the UN force. Early news from the war, however, was not good. For the first 2 months after the invasion, North Korea appeared to be winning and driving the UN and South Korean forces steadily back. Then, UN forces under MacArthur launched a desperate counterattack at Incheon. There, 70,000 troops managed to cut the North Korean supply lines and forced that army to turn and retreat, pursued and routed by UN and South Korean forces. This, in turn, led to the UN occupying North Korea for about 2 months, until December 1950. The US and UN may have pressed that advance too far, as their advance to the North Korea-China border triggered a counterattack from China. More than 300,000 Chinese soldiers and volunteers massed on the border, shifting the balance of power again. This time, however, it was the UN forces that were forced to retreat, leaving behind abandoned vehicles and equipment. MacArthur wanted to attack bases inside China in retaliation, but President Truman said no, concerned that this would lead to World War III. As U.S. General Bradley later stated, MacArthur's actions would lead to, quote, "the wrong war, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy," unquote. Eventually, Truman lost faith in MacArthur and stripped him of his command. But the war continued. A series of reversals of fortune, the advantage shifting from one side to the other and back again, until finally an armistice was signed on the 27th of July, 1953. The Korean War is sometimes referred to as a limited war or a police action, as if it doesn't quite reach the level of a real war. Over the course of the roughly 3 years following the North Korean invasion, however, the US dropped 25% more bombs just on North Korea than had been dropped in the entire Pacific theater during World War II just a decade earlier. And this doesn't even count over 32 tons of napalm that were also dropped. Napalm is a highly flammable and very sticky liquid. When it touches the surface, including the human skin, it ignites, and in the case of skin, causes severe burns. Plus, since it's sticky, it's extremely difficult to remove, maximizing the impact on the enemy. Per Wikipedia, more than 3 million Koreans were killed, went missing, or were wounded during the war, with the majority of those coming from the north, due to the heavy bombing by the UN forces. Per that same source, the death toll also included some 900,000 Chinese soldiers, 54,000 Americans, 1,000 Brits, and 4,000 from the other countries who contributed troops. It should be noted that these numbers are disputed by some other sources. The fact remains that this war had a devastating impact on Korea and its people. The Korean War is often characterized as a proxy war between the US and the West on the one hand and the USSR and China on the other. And this is hard to argue, as both Stalin and China's Mao authorized and supported the North Korean invasion. Likewise, US papers declassified in the 1970s also indicate that the West had created what the Oxford Research Encyclopedia calls a, quote, kind of war, end quote, well before North Korea ever invaded. And Truman's distrust of the Soviets led him to turn his back on the arrangements that FDR had made for a multinational trusteeship to manage Korea's transition back to independence. And these are just a few of the failed gambles and the bad decisions that have led to missed opportunity after missed opportunity to resolve this situation once and for all. It is, however, not quite that simple. While it is easy to dismiss the Korean War as a proxy war, many other factors led to and contributed, many of them internal to Korea itself. Not the least of which was the ideological divide between what today we would call the left and the right within the country, the belief in communism in the north and the anti-communism in the south. The Korean War also led to changes in how the US approached the rest of the world. US leaders shifted massive amounts of spending towards the military, and military policy in relation to Europe, NATO, Berlin, and other hotspots around the world shifted. This empowered the military-industrial complex that President Truman's successor, President Eisenhower, would warn the country about at the end of his second term many years later. But that's a story for another day. For now, let's break here. Next time, we'll pick up the relationship between the US and North Korea since the war ended. Now, normally Friday is my news and current events day, and Monday I put out a Life and Time segment. Due to a number of factors, the length of this video when I originally conceived it, the fact that I'm running 2 days late due to the technical issues in getting this ready, and the urgency of the Korean situation as it impacts our current news, this week I'm going to swap my Monday and Friday schedules, so we'll continue this tomorrow, Monday the 14th of August. Until then, please share your thoughts, feedback, opinions, and where needed corrections in the comments below. As always, if you'd like to see more content like this, please like, subscribe, and share the video. Thank you, and be good. And if you can't be good, be wicked well.